You wake up one ordinary morning in ancient Athens, feeling exceptionally uninspired. Through the small, slightly warped window of your modest home, you watch dawn creeping over rooftops, illuminating the rows of houses built so close together that privacy remains merely an ambitious dream. Outside, olive trees glisten under the first hesitant rays of sunlight. Birds chirp their annoyingly repetitive morning songs, and a donkey loudly brays its usual complaints. Your first instinct, of course, is to roll over and bury yourself deeper in the layers of your uncomfortable bed. But fate, or perhaps your own stubborn curiosity, has other plans today. As you rub sleep from your eyes and reluctantly abandon your warm blankets, a troublesome thought slithers into your mind. You realize abruptly, with the resigned horror of someone who knows they're making a mistake, but continues anyway, that you must visit the Oracle of Delphi. To be perfectly honest, you don't really have pressing questions or immediate problems that demand divine wisdom. But everyone in Athens at some point seems compelled to drag themselves to Delphi, endure hardship, and leave their silver coins in the temple treasury. It's practically tradition, tedious, and inevitably disappointing tradition. Your neighbors, gathered outside your door in their usual gossiping circle, shake their heads and sigh dramatically when you mention your intention. "Oh, Delphi," murmurs old Alcibiades, tugging at his white, tangled beard. He's seen enough years and failed journeys to fill a scroll of sad tales. Delphi, if you desire ambiguity disguised as wisdom, my friend, that's precisely where you'll find it. He recounts the tragic tale of your distant cousin Demosthenes, who traveled there years ago seeking guidance about whether to marry or remain single. The oracle's poetic yet utterly indecipherable response led Demosthenes to misunderstand its meaning entirely. As a result, he married unwisely, squandered his small fortune, and now spends his days begging coins near the agora, reciting bad poetry in a voice tinged with eternal regret. But surely, you reason, your journey will differ. Surely, your quest won't end in similar misery. After all, isn't this the most famous oracle of Greece, sought after by kings, heroes, philosophers, and occasionally poor confused souls such as yourself? Historically speaking, of course, you must acknowledge that your confidence is not fully justified. Delphi, as anyone with basic education knows, has always been a dubious enterprise cloaked in mysticism. Countless pilgrims traveled there, seeking clarity and enlightenment, only to leave more confused than before. King Croesus famously misunderstood the oracle's cryptic promise that if he attacked Persia, a great empire would fall. He assumed the great empire meant Persia, but alas, it was his own. Poor Croesus. As you ponder this unfortunate history, you briefly consider abandoning your impulsive decision. But something compels you, a curious stubbornness, perhaps, or a mildly masochistic desire to experience firsthand why generations continue their pilgrimage, despite overwhelming evidence of its futility. You spend the rest of the morning gathering knowledge from those who've previously made the voyage, meticulously cataloging the myriad miseries that await. There's the journey itself, across treacherous paths and through mountains teeming with bandits, wolves, and various mythologically exaggerated monsters. Then there's Delphi's notorious crowdedness, the long lines outside the sanctuary, and, most terrifyingly, the strange ecstatic rituals of the Pythia, the priestess who speaks for Apollo. Rituals reportedly so unsettling they've driven strong men mad. A certain Thales, your annoyingly confident neighbor, recounts gleefully how his cousin once fainted after merely witnessing the oracle's ecstatic trance. His cousin, incidentally, never fully recovered. Now, he spends his days staring vacantly into the sky, muttering incoherent verses about impending doom. Wonderful. Yet, despite all these gloomy tales, or perhaps because of them, you stubbornly persist in your preparations. Maybe you secretly enjoy misery, or perhaps you're simply curious to know exactly how disappointing the experience can be. Either way, you begin mentally preparing yourself for the journey ahead, considering carefully what you'll ask the oracle. This proves harder than expected, since your life is, by most standards, distressingly ordinary. You don't rule a kingdom, haven't fought any legendary monsters lately, and aren't trying to decide the fate of great armies. Your biggest dilemmas revolve around minor annoyances: your leaking roof, your overly inquisitive neighbors, and that irritating donkey next door that refuses to respect any reasonable sleeping schedule. Still, tradition demands you formulate some meaningful question. Thus, you ponder deeply, sifting through the trivial details of your mundane life. Perhaps you should ask whether your olive harvest will be plentiful this year, though given the oracle's infamous ambiguity, you might return home convinced you should burn your entire olive grove to appease Apollo. Or maybe you should inquire about love, though your romantic life is as barren as the rocky hills around Delphi. Indeed, every possible query seems embarrassingly insignificant when imagined spoken aloud in the august presence of the Pythia. Eventually, you settle on the safest question imaginable. Should I continue pursuing this pointless journey called life, or embrace philosophical apathy instead? A broad enough inquiry that you can interpret any vague response optimistically, cynically, or indifferently, depending on your mood. As the sun reaches its zenith, you gather basic provisions: dried fruits, salted fish, tough bread, and some suspect wine diluted with water, whose taste is only slightly less depressing than your anticipated future. You pack your coins, mindful of the obligatory offering you'll have to make to the greedy hands of Apollo's priests, along with sturdy boots and a woolen cloak designed more for itchiness than warmth. Your neighbors solemnly bid farewell, shaking their heads gravely, as though you were heading off to battle or execution rather than a mere religious pilgrimage. Alcibiades assures you cheerfully that if you perish tragically, he'll compose an appropriately melancholy poem to immortalize your misfortune. Comforting, truly. Finally, you glance once more at your modest house, which suddenly seems painfully inviting. Your bed, previously despised for its lumpiness, now calls alluringly. But you resist, close your door decisively, and step into the dusty street. You begin your uncertain journey through winding Athens, passing familiar markets and temples, realizing you're leaving comfort behind for the uncertain misery ahead. After all, why pursue simple happiness when you can instead chase questionable wisdom delivered cryptically by an oracle famed for confusing, disappointing, and occasionally ruining those who sought her counsel? You shrug and trudge forward, propelled by inexplicable determination or perhaps sheer perversity, ready for whatever tedious adventure awaits in Delphi. As you walk through the city gates, your shadow stretches dramatically ahead, as if mocking your questionable decision. This pilgrimage, you suspect, will not bring easy answers or obvious enlightenment, but at least it'll provide a sufficiently depressing story to share at future gatherings, assuming, of course, you survive to tell it. And thus, with a sigh of resignation, tempered only slightly by a perverse sort of excitement, you depart Athens, stepping forward into the unknown, embracing a journey you don't really need, but insist upon making anyway. Standing outside the city gates, you pause for an uncomfortably long moment, contemplating the daunting reality of your decision. Delphi waits far away, days of arduous travel, questionable lodging, and less than satisfactory meals lie between you and the cryptic words of the oracle. For the 100th time, you reconsider turning back. After all, home is cozy, predictable, and devoid of prophetic riddles designed explicitly to confuse ordinary citizens like yourself. But turning back now, after the emotional drama of your farewell, would be embarrassingly anticlimactic. You imagine Alcibiades chuckling mockingly, composing satirical verses on your inability to sustain even a half hearted pilgrimage. Your pride swiftly suppresses any sensible inclination toward retreat. Thus, you set yourself to the task of preparing properly for the journey, recalling the advice offered by seasoned pilgrims, advice that sounded both overly dramatic and suspiciously pessimistic when first delivered. However, their words now echo ominously in your memory. The road to Delphi demands thorough preparation. Forget one essential item, and you might as well throw yourself off Mount Parnassus. Encouraging, truly. Returning home briefly, you methodically begin packing, guided by tradition rather than practicality. After all, your Athenian ancestors knew best, or at least, they confidently claimed they did. The proper attire alone is burdensome. Ancient custom dictates the travelers must wear heavy woolen cloaks, rough enough to scrape skin, thick enough to boil you alive beneath the merciless Greek sun, yet oddly incapable of protecting you against sudden mountain chills. The cloak's lack of usefulness is balanced only by its ritual importance. You wouldn't dare approach Apollo without it. Next, you gather your sandals, designed, apparently, by someone who despised human feet. Their leather straps promise blisters large enough to have their own tragic poetry composed about them. Nevertheless, you slip them on, wincing as the straps immediately dig into your skin. At least your footwear will ensure a constantly distracting discomfort, thus preventing you from dwelling on existential dread. For sustenance, you reluctantly pack salted fish, already unpleasantly pungent, alongside dried figs hardened into near stone like consistency. You also add barley bread, which, despite its stale toughness, remains the only consistently edible item in your traveling pack. Then there is the wine, diluted heavily with water, tasting suspiciously like vinegar mixed with regret. Still, tradition demands it. As you stuff these uninspiring provisions into your sack, you recall historical accounts of ancient pilgrims, noting with mild amusement how consistently miserable their preparations were. For instance, consider the unfortunate poet Euphorion, who meticulously documented his pilgrimage to Delphi, detailing his obsessive packing, only to realize halfway there that he'd forgotten to bring money for the mandatory offering. In desperation, he was forced to barter his sandals and arrived at the temple barefoot, his journey immortalized not in praise, but ridicule. Determined to avoid a similarly humiliating fate, you repeatedly recount your silver coins, double checking them obsessively until your anxiety subsides, or at least shifts elsewhere. The tradition of offering to Apollo, after all, isn't optional. Priests guard the sanctuary with zeal typically reserved for threats against the state. Anyone failing to produce an appropriate offering might expect not divine insight, but public shame, immortalized in Delphi's notorious gossip circles. Besides money, tradition demands additional tokens intended to appease Apollo, small clay figurines, olive branches, or votive plaques inscribed with humble pleas. Historical records mention pilgrims carrying bizarre offerings, everything from intricate jewelry to live goats, the latter surely providing memorable discomfort during travels. You opt sensibly, though uncreatively, for olive branches. Their symbolic simplicity ensures you won't look ridiculous, just predictably ordinary. Now nearly done, you scrutinize your packing with weary suspicion. Is there anything you've missed? Doubt creeps in, fueled by memory of pilgrims past, whose failures serve as cautionary tales. Alcmaeon, for instance, once journeyed to Delphi forgetting his cloak, forced ultimately to borrow one stained suspiciously with someone else's misfortune. Or the unfortunate merchant Parmenides, who, distracted by philosophical ponderings, packed his bag with only papyrus scrolls, entirely neglecting food and water. He was found days later deliriously reciting unintelligible verses to an unimpressed donkey. Deciding finally your preparations suffice, you step outside once again, weighted down by your cumbersome attire and uncomfortable sandals, burdened further by an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Your neighbors, observing your renewed departure with barely concealed amusement, call out half hearted encouragement, assuring you loudly they fully expect your tragic demise. Alcibiades cheerfully promises once again to compose verses honoring your untimely end, smiling as though this was the most generous offer imaginable. The long road stretches ahead like an unpleasant metaphor for life's endless difficulties. Yet before you can dwell too long in philosophical pessimism, you realize your pack is painfully heavy, your cloak unbearably itchy, and your sandals already rubbing blisters into your feet. Practical discomfort proves far more compelling than existential contemplation. You trudge slowly out of Athens, each step reminding you precisely why you preferred staying home. As the landscape gradually shifts from urban comforts to sparse wilderness, you consider briefly whether your careful preparations will protect you from bandits, wolves, or supernatural creatures supposedly prowling the mountains. Given the notorious inefficiency of your planning, this seems unlikely. Still, you console yourself ironically. At least you packed correctly, according to tradition, regardless of practicality. Historians someday might mock your misery, but none can accuse you of disregarding ancestral wisdom, even if that wisdom has proven repeatedly dubious. Ahead, the open road offers little comfort, only dust, rocks, and the promise of more suffering before reaching Delphi. Behind you, Athens grows smaller, its comforts fading quickly into memory. You pause briefly, adjusting your heavy load, reflecting gloomily on the inevitability of disappointment awaiting pilgrims like yourself. But then, isn't that precisely the point? If pilgrimage were comfortable, enlightening, and joyful, history would lack its treasured tales of woe. Surely, Delphi's oracle thrives precisely because humans stubbornly persist in seeking wisdom through discomfort and ambiguity. Thus, resigned once again, you take another painful step forward, fully aware that no preparations, however thorough, can truly prepare you for what lies ahead. Apollo's wisdom, after all, comes wrapped not in clarity, but confusion. All your meticulous packing does little more than equip you inadequately for the inevitable hardships of a journey destined primarily to frustrate. Yet stubbornly, irrationally, you march onward, like generations before you, committed not so much to answers, but to experiencing firsthand the long tradition of disappointment awaiting at Delphi. As you finally leave behind Athens, now a distant haze shimmering in the summer sun, the cruel reality of your situation fully sinks in. Your first few hours on the road were bearable, if only because your stubborn optimism, or rather denial, held strong. But optimism, as history has repeatedly demonstrated, is notoriously fragile. It takes roughly until midday for you to begin wholeheartedly regretting your decision. The dusty path winding toward Delphi was once proudly described by poets as the road of enlightenment. Clearly, these poets never traveled it themselves, or their standards for enlightenment were incredibly low. The path, worn by centuries of weary travelers, is narrow, uneven, and thoroughly inconvenient. It snakes through hills and valleys, where each step promises either twisted ankles or bruised dignity. Historical accounts rarely mention such petty hardships, preferring heroic tales of pilgrims bravely confronting bandits or wild beasts. Sadly, your own journey promises none of these dramatic adventures, just an endless battle against tedium and discomfort. Your sandals, true to their promise, have already rubbed your feet raw. The cloak you proudly donned earlier now seems designed exclusively for torture, its woolen threads scratching skin with sadistic precision. Despite these discomforts, you move onward stubbornly, guided by vague hope, or perhaps stubborn pride, that your suffering will somehow earn favor from Apollo. The reality, however, is far less poetic. You trudge forward not heroically, but miserably, reminding yourself repeatedly how unheroic real pilgrimages typically are. Every now and then, you pass fellow travelers whose expressions mirror your own weary resignation. Occasionally, they greet you politely, though most simply nod grimly, too consumed by their own miseries to offer much more. You begin noticing a pattern among them: grim determination mixed liberally with regret, the two essential ingredients for any successful pilgrimage. As the afternoon wears on, your discomfort multiplies exponentially. The sun beats relentlessly upon your head, and you begin seriously doubting your decision to carry that heavy amphora of watered down wine. Historical records never adequately convey how truly irritating it is to carry liquid that tastes increasingly like despair with each sip. Of course, boredom itself proves to be its own kind of misery. Hours stretch monotonously, punctuated only by the occasional donkey bray or distant barking dogs. At one point, hoping to distract yourself, you briefly ponder philosophy, perhaps the wisdom of Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle. But philosophy quickly proves inadequate in the face of sore feet and the growing ache in your shoulders. Your boredom, however, momentarily lifts when you encounter a traveling merchant, loudly advertising questionable wares along the roadside. He enthusiastically presents you with various useless objects, promising they will surely impress Apollo himself. These include small clay figurines of questionable authenticity, cheap jewelry, and even alleged fragments from the original laurel tree, sacred to the oracle, supposedly capable of magically clarifying prophetic riddles. You politely decline, suspecting correctly that purchasing such items would only enhance your inevitable disappointment. Nevertheless, the merchant's cheerful insistence amuses you briefly until he enthusiastically recounts stories of previous customers who met tragic ends after neglecting to buy his charms. You leave him hastily, somewhat unsettled, wondering if future travelers will hear similarly embellished tales about your own misfortunes. As evening approaches, you face a new dilemma: finding suitable lodging. Historical sources rarely describe the miserable reality of roadside inns, likely because poets and historians preferred grand adventures over mundane misfortunes. Yet roadside inns remain integral to any pilgrimage experience, usually serving as excellent reminders of how much better your bed at home truly was. You finally locate one such inn, optimistically named Apollo's Rest, which upon closer inspection appears anything but divine. Its rooms are little more than cramped spaces lined with straw, its food barely edible, and its atmosphere gloomily oppressive. The innkeeper greets you with practiced indifference, demanding payment in advance with suspicious eagerness. Clearly, his confidence in your survival is low. You reluctantly surrender a few coins and attempt settling in. Sleep, however, proves elusive, as the inn is crowded with fellow pilgrims loudly recounting their miserable journeys to each other. Listening unwillingly to their conversations, you learn valuable historical lessons about travel, how bandits, wolves, and even sudden storms routinely complicate pilgrimages, often in depressingly creative ways. One particularly vocal traveler describes narrowly escaping a group of bandits who stole everything but his sandals, which they generously allowed him to keep, likely recognizing their potential for causing long term misery. Another shares stories of the mountain pass you must soon cross, infamous for rock slides and wolves bold enough to snatch food from travelers' hands. You silently curse yourself for ever leaving Athens, certain your death will now become yet another cautionary tale for future pilgrims. The following morning, feeling neither rested nor particularly optimistic, you resume your journey. Predictably, the terrain worsens. The mountains loom ahead, their peaks wrapped ominously in mist. The path grows steeper, narrower, and less hospitable, providing ample opportunities for injury or humiliation. Historical accounts romantically describe this part of the journey as the testing grounds of Apollo, conveniently omitting just how unpleasant these tests are. You briefly encounter another traveling philosopher who, unlike yourself, seems bizarrely delighted by every hardship. He enthusiastically explains how pain and discomfort purify the soul, offering lengthy explanations that do nothing to soothe your increasingly painful blisters. Eventually, you politely excuse yourself, preferring physical misery to philosophical lectures justifying it. By midday, the scenery finally changes from monotonous rocks to somewhat picturesque wilderness, though you barely appreciate it through the haze of fatigue and irritation. Wolves, thankfully, remain absent, though occasionally you spot goats staring judgmentally from distant slopes, clearly unimpressed by your struggles. Their silent disdain feels almost personal. Late afternoon finally brings you within sight of Delphi itself, or at least its distant outskirts. You pause briefly, staring at the distant, sunlit slopes of Mount Parnassus. Historically, Delphi is supposed to inspire awe and reverence in pilgrims approaching its sacred grounds. Instead, your primary emotion is relief, tempered only by anticipation of further suffering. You recall tales of ancient travelers who supposedly wept tears of joy upon seeing Delphi's temple shining brilliantly under Apollo's gaze. You suspect strongly their tears were less joyful gratitude and more exhausted relief. No historical accounts describe pilgrims collapsing dramatically to the ground upon arrival, though you feel sorely tempted to become the first. Instead, you push forward, stubbornly ignoring the myriad pains your body is loudly protesting. Your feet ache, your shoulders scream, and your entire being seems engaged in mutiny against further travel. Yet Delphi lies within reach, its promises of wisdom and disappointment equally tantalizing. Finally, entering Delphi's outskirts, you find yourself slightly comforted by familiar sights. Other pilgrims nursing sore feet, merchants hawking dubious relics, and jaded priests eyeing newcomers like vultures awaiting fresh prey. History repeats itself constantly here, pilgrims drawn inevitably toward the promise of wisdom delivered cryptically through Apollo's oracle. Despite everything, the blisters, aching muscles, boredom, discomfort, and existential doubts, you've arrived. Whether this triumph ultimately means enlightenment or bitter regret, you have yet to discover. But one thing remains certain: your journey has already convincingly demonstrated that wisdom gained through pilgrimage inevitably comes accompanied by misery. Apollo, it seems, prefers teaching lessons the hard way. You stand on the outskirts of Delphi, legs trembling from exhaustion, feet aching in your merciless sandals, and gaze upon what historians call the sacred sanctuary of Apollo. You remember the words of poets and philosophers who once praised this spot as the luminous heart of wisdom, a place that inspires awe and spiritual enlightenment. Now, seeing it for yourself, you strongly suspect those writers never actually visited the place or were generously bribed by temple officials. The scene before you isn't so much sacred or awe inspiring as it is chaotically crowded and aggressively commercialized. Pilgrims swarm the narrow streets, stumbling like sleep deprived ghosts, each carrying similarly miserable expressions. Merchants, loudly hawking dubious charms, thrust cheap votive figures of Apollo into the faces of bewildered visitors, insisting these clay trinkets guarantee divine favor. Food vendors cry out, promising meals blessed by Apollo, though judging by the nauseous looks of those already eating, the blessing is questionable at best. This is not the Delphi you imagined from epic poetry or historic scrolls. The reality is gritty, noisy, and disturbingly mundane. Where you expected tranquility, you find bustling confusion. Where you sought solemn reverence, you encounter rudeness and impatience. For instance, temple priests patrol aggressively through crowds, herding pilgrims toward the oracle's sanctuary like shepherds, pushing reluctant sheep toward slaughter. Realizing you must join the line, you shuffle obediently behind dozens, possibly hundreds, of exhausted pilgrims. The queue snakes its way upward, climbing steep stone steps worn smooth by countless weary feet. Ancient inscriptions cover the walls, admonishing visitors with advice so vague and cryptic that understanding them might require another pilgrimage entirely. Know thyself reads one famously frustrating engraving, prompting you to bitterly wonder why you'd traveled all this way for wisdom clearly attainable from home. As you inch upward slowly, your neighbors in line share tales of equally frustrating journeys. An elderly woman ahead of you recounts being robbed by bandits who ironically lectured her about greed before stealing her silver coins. A young man behind you boasts of encountering wolves on the mountain pass, though judging by his unconvincing bravado, the encounter probably involved little more than distant barking. Still, everyone listens politely, understanding that sharing misfortunes helps pass the time. Historical accounts typically omit the boredom and annoyance of waiting endlessly for prophetic wisdom. Scholars prefer discussing grand prophecies delivered by the oracle to great heroes and kings, conveniently overlooking ordinary pilgrims who stood miserably in line, slowly losing hope and occasionally their sanity as they waited their turn. Finally, nearing the temple entrance, you notice an official vigorously collecting mandatory donations, loudly reminding pilgrims of Apollo's supposed generosity and how costly it is to maintain divine favor. Reluctantly handing over your carefully counted coins, you bitterly suspect that Apollo, though possibly divine, operates suspiciously like a businessman profiting handsomely from people's anxiety and uncertainty. Entering the temple sanctuary at last, you're startled by its gloomy atmosphere. Poets described it as a place of radiant spiritual illumination. Instead, it's dark, shadowy, and oppressive. Flickering oil lamps cast eerie patterns on walls adorned with strange carvings depicting ambiguous scenes, perhaps gods wrestling demons, or possibly just priests counting their collected coins. The priests themselves lurk in corners, solemnly chanting hymns in monotones that inspire not reverence, but a creeping sense of unease. Finally, you approach the inner sanctum, where the famous oracle, the Pythia, waits to deliver Apollo's prophecy. The room, thick with incense smoke, feels suffocating rather than mystical. The Pythia herself sits hunched upon a tripod seat, eyes rolling back slightly, muttering incoherently as she inhales fumes rising mysteriously from cracks in the floor. Priests assure visitors these vapors are divine. You suspect strongly they're just hallucinogenic gases, conveniently creating the illusion of divine inspiration. As your turn approaches, anxiety rises. You've traveled days, endured hardships, spent valuable coins, all for this moment. Yet watching the oracle now, you wonder if any prophecy delivered here ever genuinely helped anyone. Historical examples swirl in your mind. Croesus's ruinous misunderstanding, Oedipus's tragic fate, countless other ambiguities misinterpreted disastrously. Will your prophecy differ? A priest abruptly announces your name, pulling you forward. He instructs you to ask your question clearly and briefly. Heart racing, you recall your carefully rehearsed an inquiry. Should I continue pursuing this pointless journey called life, or embrace philosophical apathy instead? Then promptly forget it entirely, suddenly overwhelmed by panic. Hastily improvising, you blurt out, "Great Apollo, tell me clearly, is happiness possible, or should I simply embrace despair?" The Pythia groans softly, sways dramatically, and then murmurs words so cryptic, so painfully ambiguous, you struggle immediately to understand them. The sun shines brightest where shadows deepen. In seeking joy, sorrow follows. Wisdom lies hidden where least expected. You blink slowly, stunned. The priests, accustomed to pilgrims' confusion, quickly usher you away, assuring you cheerfully that clarity will come later, a phrase clearly rehearsed from years of experience. You stumble outside, replaying the oracle's words repeatedly in your mind, attempting desperately to decipher them. Yet the more you consider them, the more meaningless they seem. Historically, of course, the oracle's vague words were always deliberately obscure, cleverly designed to appear profound while remaining safely noncommittal. Kings, generals, philosophers, ordinary travelers all left Delphi convinced they'd received profound wisdom, yet returned home confused, disappointed, or disastrously misguided. Now you understand exactly how. Exhausted, frustrated, and thoroughly bewildered, you find a small, quiet spot away from the temple crowds to reflect bitterly on your experience. Delphi's wisdom, you realize, consists primarily of cleverly disguised ambiguity, expensive donations, and calculated theatrics. You almost admire its priests for their ingenious ability to convince generations of pilgrims that confusion equals divine wisdom. Historical accounts rarely discuss this cynical reality openly, probably because pilgrims preferred romanticizing their experiences afterward rather than admitting they'd been duped. You, however, feel no such obligation. Delphi, you conclude bitterly, thrives precisely because humans crave simple answers to complex questions, foolishly believing obscure riddles hold profound meaning. Slowly descending back toward the bustling street below, you watch arriving pilgrims still hopeful, eagerly ascending the steps you've just descended. You recognize their faces, the same naive excitement you yourself had mere hours earlier, and pity them slightly. They too will soon confront Apollo's famous ambiguity, pay their mandatory offerings, and return home with empty pockets and profound confusion. Yet perhaps that itself is Delphi's truest wisdom, teaching pilgrims humility through disappointment, caution through confusion, and resignation through frustration. Apollo, after all, might never have intended clarity. Perhaps his greatest lesson is reminding humans how little they genuinely understand. As daylight fades, you contemplate the final stage of your journey, returning home, supposedly wiser, certainly poorer, and ironically more confused than before. You can't help feeling that poets and historians who've praised Delphi so enthusiastically owe you, and countless others, a sincere apology. But of course, Apollo never apologizes. He merely smiles cryptically from afar, eternally amused by humanity's futile attempts to understand him. Leaving Delphi behind proves surprisingly uncomplicated, at least physically. You simply turn your back on the temple, the oracle, and the town, and start walking, though emotionally, your departure feels deeply unsatisfying. You had arrived seeking clarity, but found only ambiguity wrapped in expensive robes. Still, despite the frustration, there's a strange comfort in leaving behind a place that promised answers but delivered only confusion. Your greatest wisdom, ironically, may be realizing the futility of asking questions that have no clear answers. As the path descends from Mount Parnassus, you glance back once more, seeing Delphi nestled into its mountainside, deceptively serene. In the golden morning light, it almost looks beautiful, but you've learned by now that appearances deceive. History romanticized Delphi, describing it poetically as the navel of the world, a place of enlightenment and profound wisdom. Yet, having experienced it firsthand, you understand now that poetry and history rarely match reality. The temple, the priests, the oracle, all were impressive in performance, yet empty beneath the surface. You trudge down the road, retracing the route of your outward journey, every step reminding you just how weary you are. Your sandals, predictably, continue their relentless assault upon your blistered feet. Your cloak feels heavier, burdened with disappointment, more than wool. Historical accounts never mention this part, the weary walk home, the bitter aftertaste of unsatisfied expectations, the realization that your pilgrimage has left you poorer in coins and richer only in cynical perspective. Soon you encounter pilgrims heading toward Delphi, faces filled with hopeful excitement you recognize instantly, having worn the same expression mere days ago. They enthusiastically inquire about your experience, eager for reassurance and inspiration. You hesitate briefly, considering honesty, telling them outright that the oracle will confuse, frustrate, and impoverish them. Yet something holds you back, a subtle pity or perhaps simple resignation. Instead, you nod cryptically, advising them vaguely, the oracle will answer precisely what you don't expect. They thank you earnestly, utterly unaware you've offered only meaningless ambiguity, identical to Delphi's wisdom itself. Historical accounts rarely discuss pilgrims misleading future travelers, perhaps because embarrassment prevents the honesty. Yet, you understand perfectly now. Pilgrims perpetuate Delphi's allure not through truth, but through silence or ambiguous encouragement. Apollo's shrine survives precisely because returning pilgrims, unwilling to admit their foolishness openly, keep its myths alive. Your journey back toward Athens proves physically uncomfortable, but otherwise uneventful. Bandits, wolves, and supernatural creatures remain absent, almost disappointingly so. Historically, tales of returning pilgrims frequently included dramatic misfortunes, robberies, shipwrecks, curses, but your experience stubbornly refuses drama. Instead, you face a simpler, quieter form of misery, relentless boredom, nagging regret, and constant discomfort. At one roadside inn, appropriately named Apollo's Mercy, though Apollo, you've learned, rarely shows any, you meet other returning pilgrims similarly jaded, gathered around a rickety table, eating flavorless stew. They share their equally ambiguous oracle experiences. A merchant gloomily recounts how Apollo's cryptic prophecy led him to make catastrophic business decisions, bankrupting him entirely. A philosopher, previously cheerful, now bitterly complains that the oracle's vague pronouncement left him more uncertain about life's purpose than ever before. Listening to them, you realize your disappointment is hardly unique. Historically, Delphi's ambiguous prophecies notoriously ruined lives through misinterpretation. King Croesus lost his empire. Heroes doomed themselves, chasing impossible destinies. Ordinary pilgrims, similarly confused, rarely earned historical mention, yet their misfortunes were equally profound. Sitting amongst them now, you wonder how many anonymous lives Apollo indirectly damaged through his carefully worded riddles. As days pass and you approach Athens, memories of your pilgrimage grow distant, softened slightly by the familiar comforts ahead. Soon, you glimpse Athens rising proudly in the distance, its temples gleaming beautifully under the afternoon sun. Yet your return feels oddly anticlimactic. Unlike heroes returning from epic quests greeted with praise and celebration, your homecoming inspires minimal interest. Neighbors barely acknowledge your return, surprised only that you're alive. Alcibiades, predictably, greets you warmly, clearly disappointed that you survived to deny him his promised tragic poem. Entering your modest house again, you find its comforts suddenly profound. Your bed, previously despised for its lumps, feels miraculously welcoming. The dull olive trees outside seem reassuringly ordinary. For a moment, you consider your journey's pointlessness, its foolish hardships, wasted coins, and ambiguous wisdom. Yet somehow, returning home, poorer, certainly, yet oddly relieved, you finally understand Delphi's true lesson. Clarity rarely comes from external prophecies or divine wisdom. Perhaps true enlightenment lies simply in accepting life's inherent ambiguity without seeking easy answers. In the following days, neighbors approach curiously, asking cautiously about your pilgrimage. Unlike earlier travelers, you answer truthfully this time, admitting openly Delphi's frustrating ambiguity. Surprisingly, they seem unsurprised, almost relieved. You realize then that perhaps pilgrims always returned secretly disappointed, simply never daring admit openly that Delphi's wisdom was merely confusion, disguised as a profound insight. Ironically, your honesty becomes popular among neighbors who eagerly discuss their own failed pilgrimages, relieved finally to admit openly their shared disappointment. Historical accounts rarely recorded such candid conversations, preferring heroic narratives. Yet here, in the quiet corners of ordinary life, you see clearly Delphi's truth. Everyone was equally confused, disappointed, and slightly poorer, hiding their disillusionment behind cryptic smiles and forced optimism. Your pilgrimage thus ends quietly, lacking epic grandeur, yet perhaps richer for its honesty. You never fully decipher Apollo's cryptic prophecy, though occasionally you ponder its ambiguous meaning. The sun shines brightest where shadows deepen. In seeking joy, sorrow follows. Wisdom lies hidden where least expected. Perhaps the oracle merely meant life itself, full of bright moments, shadowed inevitably by difficulty, joy pursued alongside sorrow, wisdom hiding precisely where you least anticipate finding it. Time passes, and you resume ordinary life, tending olive groves, tolerating neighbors, and occasionally mocking Delphi's wisdom among friends. Ironically, you become known locally as an authority on pilgrimage failures, offering humorous advice to prospective travelers. Expect nothing clearly, pay dearly, and return confused. Surprisingly, this advice deters few pilgrims. Delphi's appeal, inexplicably, remains irresistible. Historically, Delphi's oracle persisted long after you, surviving precisely because humans stubbornly pursued impossible clarity. You, however, remain content, having learned your lesson firsthand. True wisdom perhaps lies in accepting ambiguity calmly rather than chasing false promises of certainty. Thus, Apollo's cryptic words indeed taught you something valuable, though whether you're genuinely wiser or merely cynically resigned remains ambiguous, fittingly enough. And so your pilgrimage, begun impulsively, pursued stubbornly, and ended ambiguously, quietly fades into memory. You become merely another anonymous pilgrim among thousands who sought Delphi's wisdom, paid handsomely, and returned poorer in coins, yet subtly richer in skeptical perspective. Perhaps history will overlook your ordinary experience, but you accept this quietly. After all, genuine wisdom rarely makes grand history. More often, It simply returns home, slightly disappointed, yet finally at peace with life's eternal uncertainty.